So we begin as usual with our customary prayer for student and teacher. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Mastoma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy. May our study be illumined. May we not unnecessarily quarrel with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So we're continuing with our study of the Katha Upanishad. Just to remind you, Katha refers to a story, and the story revolves around a young boy, Nachiketa. He has the great faith that young people have, but still is acute enough and astute enough to ask serious questions that we should all be asking. But the mind is normally deviated with many other things. Looking at what is the substratum of life is one of the most difficult things to do, because we know from last week that this subject is very subtle. It's not the obvious thing. Modern science has made great leaps and bounds in the area of understanding the nature of nature itself. And they come to a conclusion that what we call the substratum of existence, that is, tables, chairs, other molecular things, the things of daily life, the whole thing is inscrutable. We can't really understand it. And more accurately, we can't understand its behavior. It seems to go along with the characteristics described here in this Katha Upanishad. While sitting, it travels far away. While sleeping, it goes everywhere. We try and trace at the subatomic level, photons, electrons, etc., where they exactly are and what they're doing. We have to apply something called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells us that we can never really have an absolute certainty about anything. But life doesn't look like that. It looks extremely certain. And the future, even though it hasn't arrived, seems to look certain. We speculate about future events. And the past certainly seemed to be a passing real train of events. And right now, as we speak, you're sitting on a chair or the floor. In front of you may be a television. There are four walls. This certainly seems to be a reality. It certainly seems to be fixed. But when you see how, if you shift your perspective, all this looks very different. We're dealing with a kind of play of waves underneath everything. And at a very fundamental level, we're dealing with appearance and disappearances, what is called a field, quantum field. So things are not quite what they seem to be. How does that affect us in practical life? It affects us in this way. If we're looking for that thing that never changes, if we're looking for that thing that remains stationary while asinaha, sitting, something that is motionless, something that is indefinable, something that, even though we retreat into a dream world, its whole characteristic changes. And when we go into a dreamless sleep world, in other words, when consciousness is totally withdrawn, so that there's just a sameness everywhere, still we find it there. Wherever we look, we find it, like inscrutable waves that find a possibility of particles being simultaneously everywhere and doing what we consider to be unusual things. So how do we grasp this thing, and why should we do it? Relentlessly, the Upanishads tell us, if we want to relieve ourselves of sorrow, this fundamental understanding we have to grasp, because its nature is joyful and joyous. And what seems to make it otherwise is because there are some limiting agents. We have some examples for that, yes. Electricity is always flowing. The electrical current is present. As we sit here, where I put my finger, this is where it is. We don't notice it. We don't understand it's there. When we want to tune into a broadcast, we haven't got to go to the broadcast station, and we don't ask for an import from the broadcaster, having each person having its individual access to their individual broadcast, not at all. Where we sit is where it is, right here in this electromagnetic field. In this same way, the self is here. And the only way we can register it, or register its existence, is when we put a suitable funneling device, when we channel that by putting on some kind of what is called limiting adjunct. The limiting adjunct is also, on the other side, a manifesting adapter. The electrical current being there, we put in a suitable adapting mechanism that will manifest a certain aspect of the electromagnetic field. Sometimes it's light, sometimes it's heat. An air conditioner is something very different. Sometimes it's sound, and it can be manifest, it can be seen. When we put in certain devices, we can see the X-ray element, the gamma ray element. We don't know either side of the color spectrum, infrared, ultraviolet. We have to put a special adapter to try and locate this. It is not normally seen with the current adapters of the eyes and the ears and all these senses. And even so, we still have to have something called intelligence to make any sense about it. Intelligence is that kind of manifesting adapter that registers a deciding characteristic, a determining characteristic, an executive officer characteristic. All of that is there in the internal world, but it is also an adapter that we can see. We can understand it is something separate from the fundamental thing. It's become common practice now to say that intelligence is an emanating thing. It is an epiphenomena of the brain. But that would be very much like saying that a spider is manifested from a spider web. But we know for a fact it's the other way around. We know that it's the spider that manifests the spider web, and if you poke the spider web, it just bounces. It's not sentient at all. But it is constructed in such a sensitive way that whatever it catches will wriggle in it, and the spider then knows something is there. And the spider himself can wriggle it also. Can walk on it, and the whole thing bounces. So this is the characteristic really of something that is sentient, something that is insentient, and we can notice the difference between the two. And so how do we know this? So the stanza goes like this. Ashariram sharireshu anaveshtishta avastitam mahantam vibham atmanam matta dhiro na shochati. We covered this last week, but this is a refreshment of these ideas. Having meditated on the self, what I mean by the self is not this psychophysical self. That would be equivalent to the spider's web. What makes it look as if it is living is that the entity that is shining through it makes it come alive. And that shining, or everything else shines, whether it's the human body, the human mind, the external world, the internal world, we can divide it in this way, but also the sun shining, all kinds of stellar bodies, galaxies, anything that seems to have life. We now know in biology that all the mutations that we observe, to try and trace back Where did this biological life come from? We now know absolutely by studying things like ribose and chlorophyll that it is because of fusion. Things decided to join forces with other things. The investigation is quite remarkable, and comparatively recently, we didn't know this. But what makes this fusion occur? And when we become humans, of course, when all of this joins together, we want to be social creatures. We also want to join with others. We also have a sense of collectivism and cooperation. So what is the thing which is standing behind that doesn't really get involved? Just by its presence, everything else moves. It must be something very, very subtle and cannot be shown on the outside, cannot be shown in an objective way, whether it is the objects that are seen by the sense organs, or whether it is to see all the flowing activity through the mental frame and all the feelings, all the ups and downs coming and going like waves. That non-wave entity is sitting, looking at it, and it is the enjoyer because it is the witness. There are funny examples of a play going wrong, and it becomes a moment of anxiety for those who are playing the game, who are acting on the stage. If you don't have the scene or the scenery very stable, it can collapse and fall down. And if the actor is in any way nervous and thinks, maybe I'll forget my lines, then the chances are the actor will forget his lines, or his or her lines. And will the audience like it? Will they throw things at me? Or will they clap? Will the review in the newspapers be kind to me? Or will they be a criticism and tear me and my performance apart and ruin my whole reputation? All these anxious moments go through if you're playing on the stage. But if you're sitting in the audience, none of this is going on. The witness is also an enjoyer. They don't have that same anxiety. They're simply seeing what's going on, and they're enjoying, clapping at appropriate moments, and cheering at other moments, but always observing this play. This play of mental waves is there, and it is our enjoyment to have a look at it and to see it. And so this self is also a witness of all the events going on. But how do we know it? And so this self cannot be known through much study, but even before that, having meditated on the self. In other words, we know it through meditation. But what do we mean by meditation? One of the greatest misunderstandings about these mystic subjects is that we need to throw out all our thoughts. We need to keep our mind blank. When a thought arises, we squash it. Something like a fun fair. Something comes up, and we are given a mallet called a mantra, and every time it comes up, we hit it, and it goes down. Another one there, another one there, another one there. Constant activity, trying to smash every thought with a mantra, becomes meaningless and helpless to us. We won't discover anything in this way. We have to use the instrumentation, which is the mind itself, and we have to make it go to subtler and subtler and subtler areas. That really is meditation, a kind of game of guiding thought inwards until we discover at an aha moment, aha, that's it. And it may be a split second, or it may last for longer. And as you practice more, tendency is for it to last longer and longer and longer until it becomes a habitual thing. And then we can stand in a poised area where only one thought remains. This truly is meditation. So we're all on a journey of self-discovery in many, many ways. And if we think that we have a number of fields in front of us, we are discovering things about ourselves physically as we get older. We can no longer do some of the things we used to do when we were younger. That's one aspect. But also the mind. If we're not careful, the mind gets entrenched in fixed habits which are not very useful to us. in fact, which hides this truth which is within us and tends to sabotage our efforts. So meditation is the answer. What should we meditate on? We should meditate on this divine self, which is so subtle. It doesn't move, but appears to move. And it has no body. So having meditated on this self as having no body, no parts, bodiless, in the midst of bodies, and permanent in the midst of impermanence. The beautiful, beautiful series of descriptions that can only be really grasped when we go into the interior and get the experience of it. It has no body. It has no mind. It has no features. And yet, it is not nothing. It is everything. It is the sum totality of everything. It's permanent in the midst of all the impermanent, and that is, wherever we look, it's impermanent. Impermanent means it's subject to the vagaries of change within a framework of time and space that is also convenient for us to grasp it. Using this fabric, using this structure, we can use the advantage of time in order to assert something that is investigative, something that is noble, something that brings us to the purer truth step by step. And as a great and pervasive, it's great and it's pervasive. In other words, whatever we look at that has a body, that has parts, we can see that there's a flowing entity going through all hands, all arms, all eyes, all limbs, all adapters, in other words. We have to get used to the idea, excuse me, of seeing all the things in front of us as a multiple set of adapters, and the human personality, a multi-adaptive mechanism, a body that has multi-adaptive parts. And this current is moving, pervading through all of these things, as it were. And so if you know this, what is the practical effect? You can't grieve. You'll only grieve when you put an object in front and when you bring up a desire to sustain something that has a body, something has a mind, in other words, something that has an individuality that sets itself apart and decides that it will struggle against all other bodies, all other personalities, all other people, trying to make some sense in a world of multiplicity. And the difficulty is we are thinking that we are embodied. This has no body. The self, in its own nature, is like space, says the commentator. And having meditated on that self, that it is unembodied, ashariram, is that bodiless self in the midst of all other bodies. Those that have no fixity amidst not only human bodies, but also other entities. And of course it is great. Unless the greatness be taken relatively, or relativity in terms of things in relation to other things, the text has this to say, it is vibhum. That is, it is all pervasive. It pervades everywhere. If you think that it is something like a bird in a cage, caught in the rib cage of the human body, because it is said to be within the heart. We will find it in the heart. It means in the core of our own being. Just like the king called the sun is the heart of the solar system. In the same way, this entity is the heart of our own being. But it pervades everywhere. So we have to understand that it is not limited or limiting. And the word Atman, self, it primarily, of course, means this indwelling self, not the embodied self. So Muttva, having meditated as I am this, on this self, that is of this kind. Dhiraha, the wise person. I don't know if there are many people who are a wise person, but the wise person who says that all of these activities in the outside world, in comparison to this, are like playing a constant game of trivial pursuit, never really getting to that fundamental reality. So they don't grieve. There's no grounds for grieving. Na shochati, does not grieve. For grief cannot reasonably belong to a person of this kind who has known this self. Everywhere we look, we find tremendous sorrow. Everybody is looking for panacea to remove all their ills. But here this Upanishad is telling what it is. Why don't more people deal with it? Why don't more people go on this internal journey of self-discovery? It is because people are not wise enough to do it. They take the superficial value and try to deal with it. But here's a multi-purpose tool that we have called non-dualism that says, wait. Why don't we shift your perspective? Why don't we see it from this point of view? Why don't we go inward and declare, I am that? Now, you can't do it when you're engaged in the external world. And if we put it in more theistic language, in France, there was one of the participants of the Yoga Nidra workshop. He said, yes. He said, I am God. I said, no way, you cannot say it. Because you don't really mean it. And what we mean by God is really that supreme self, on a universal basis, with a certain adapter, which we call Maya, and peeping through that is what we call theistic personal God. You can't say you're that, but we can say we are Brahman. And we can only say that when we experience it in those depths of meditation. So, how do we grasp this? What would we do? Nayam atma pravachanina labhyo na medhaya na puhna shrutina yam avesha vrunute tena labasya tasyaisha atma vivrunate tanam swam. The self cannot be known through much study. You get people at university studying philosophy or theology and say, I'll study this and I'll let you know. There you get people who hook on to scripture and they say, we only believe in the scripture, this text torturing. But all the great religious reformers eschewed this idea. Were combating the letter of the law versus the spirit of it. And you won't find it in a book. You hear the phrase, the Bible said this, the Bible said that. Scripture says this, Scripture says that. Now the Bible and the Quran and all these texts are quite thick texts. And if you put it to your ear, you won't hear anything. A kind of fun way of illustrating my point. It's not the text which is saying something. By meditating on it, you'll get the inner meaning. And by meditating on the subject, you get the inner meaning. But you won't get it by much study. It's not subject to academic pursuit. You won't get a degree in spirituality and self-discovery. And it's not through the intellect. It's not done through reasoning. If you have a contest between the head and the heart, you should really make the heart win in a positive way. You should try and see the inner beauty of everything. And the meditation process is dry and invalid unless you attach some feeling to it. So now, nor through the intellect, nor through much hearing, people nowadays will hear all this message about Vedanta and yoga and so on, all on YouTube. If you want to do something that you have never done before, You simply go to YouTube, you get the instructions, and now you simply duplicate the activities for yourself. And now everybody can be an expert in a few moments just by tuning into the YouTube channel. Is spirituality like that? We hear so many people say, oh, I listen to you on YouTube. And I tell them, I'm sorry about that. I give an apology. Or I listen to very famous Swamis or good speakers. Well, that won't give you anything. It may give you ideas. It may give you inspirations. But from the practice point of view, the discovery point of view, it has no value. Nor through much hearing, it can be known through the self alone and the aspiring praise too. This self of that seeker reveals its true nature. Now we come to a theological understanding that we can phrase as divine grace. The self can't be attained through any of these things, sermons or intellectual activity, or listening to a lot of the scriptures or commentaries on the scriptures, or even as you're listening now to me. But he whom the self chooses, a wonderful phrase, who the self chooses, by him the self can be gained. To him the self reveals its subtle nature. This requires some explanation. We have many beautiful examples. The most beautiful example, or one of the most beautiful examples, we can see from Sri Ramakrishna's example of wind. The wind of God's grace is always flowing. We but have to set our sails. So the wind of God's grace, divine grace, and we are setting the sail, we are just catching it. We put it in water terms also, that if you want a flow of water, transferring it laboriously from one area to another is not very efficient. Simply making an opening in a dam wall will make the water flow by itself. It will just simply gush forward. Effortlessly, it will do it. And so, this effortless way of doing things is an easy route, but how do we gain access to it? So people are listening to this broadcast, how do we gain access to it? Well, you had to do a tuning. You had to make sure that you were following a link on YouTube, because in the atmosphere, this broadcast is really there. It's carried through by radio waves and carried to you. And the technology we have with these waves, either through satellite or through radio broadcasts, this is a marvelous thing in today's world of communication. It's because there are waves that are oscillating in this atmosphere as we speak, and the vibration is being picked up by my voice. It starts here in the voice box, a little croaky today. And then that vibration is carried through the air, and the air carries it because the air is a media, and it's like waves pushing other waves, pushing other waves, pushing other waves. You have some kind of detector somewhere that catches it as a substation and relays it on, pushing the waves until finally they arrive at your ear. And then there's a very complex system of mechanisms going on in there, in an ear and so on. It takes it to a brain center, and the brain center says, oh, I recognize this. And it's all done in a split second. Because the waves are part of an ocean. There is no separation in it. There's a continuum, one affecting the other, until we find it. Not quite simultaneously, split second gap, but almost so. So the self is not attained. Labhya is not to be known through the acquisition of many Vedas. Pravachanana is not done through scholarship. And na medaya, not through the intellect, through the power of grasping the meaning of the texts. Na bohuna, shrutina, not through much hearing, not through much hearing alone. It has to be reflected on and then meditated on so that we get the real richness of the depth of it. How is it then to be known? So it said, Yameva, that self, indeed, which is his, that is the aspirant's own self. This one, the aspirant, that the aspirant prays to, by that very self, which is the seeker, the self itself can be known. Now, some people will take this in a pessimistic way, a fatalistic way. So, I'm subject to God's will that selects whether I have a revelation or not. But this example of things flowing mitigates against that. It tells us, no, this wind of God's grace is always blowing, it's always there, but our attention is pitched elsewhere. When we take our attention and tune it properly in, I'll just mute you there. When we take our attention and properly tune it in, we catch it. But if we are in practice enamored with what is in front, with simply the adapters and not what is behind there flowing through, we won't catch it. And the mind is so diverse. Most of us have a condition in the mind which is called scattered. Ekagra is the opposite. Ekagra is taking all of that attention and steering it in one single direction. And that then becomes a revealing factor. It's a standing thing that is prepared to reveal. But it requires the grace in the beginning for us to understand, let us try and steer our attention in a different way. And nature has a way of pushing us in this direction, is designed like that. One who has not desisted from bad conduct is the condition. So the next stanza will tell us this. Navirato dushcharitam nashanto nasamahita dashanta manaso vapi prajnan enam apnuyat. You have to change your habits. One who has not desisted from bad conduct, says this translation. By the way, I'm following the first volume, 8 Upanishads, with the commentary of Shankaracharya, translated by Swami Purnananda, whose senses are not under control. First of all, bad conduct. What does bad conduct constitute? Something that upsets our harmony, something that is egocentrically based. Now, if we examine all our conduct, much of it is egocentrically based. Let's take human love, for example. You say you love somebody, examine it carefully and see whether it is not because you love yourself more. And this person will provide love to you. Love will flow to you. So this is an example of where this subject is very subtle. So good moral conduct implies that there is a strength and there's a lack of egocentricity. We now have to resort to Swami Vivekananda's definitions of these two things. What is morality? That kind of behavior and way of thinking that gives the greatest strength, all-inclusively, is the highest moral position. And what is ethics? Ethics that has the least egocentric position, the least selfishness. That will be the highest ethical position. Now we understand much more what bad conduct and good conduct constitutes. So from sinful works, either prohibited by universal moral law, in yoga philosophy is contained in this first step is yama, that you have to impose some kind of moral control, 5 items are there, something like the 10 commandments, but much more general and much more useful when you examine it carefully. Ahimsa, non-injury in thought, word, and deed, the opposite side of the coin. Universal love, non-demanding love for everybody, everywhere. Try to cultivate that. Then there's satyam, there's truth, truthfulness. We've seen how the way we view the world, normally speaking, is not the most real position. If we are to be truthful, then we have to see that the thoughts, words, and deeds all match, and that are based on some fundamental reality. Non-stealing, nothing belongs to us. Even if you're an atheist, you have to acknowledge that we are running on bottled sunshine. It doesn't belong to us. Brahmacharya, severe control over all the senses that make for natural selection. That is survival of the fittest, our own survival, by making sure that we sustain our biological integrity, eating, drinking, sleeping. And sometimes that will involve competition. The more sophisticated variety of this will be the underhand competition at the workplace, enhancement of your career. It means enhancement of your power. We see it everywhere. We see it in business. We see it in politics. We see it in international affairs. And then propagation of the species. Using the internal biological drive to multiply, we now engage in that organ which is necessary for it. We're not saying it's bad. All we're saying is it has to be controlled. Today, it seems out of control. And yet that's the most telling thing. And then, ultimately, asserting a sense of independence, not going with the flow, making sure that you don't receive gifts that give you a dependency. So these are all contained in the yoga philosophy, nicely set out for us to describe. These are the general moral precepts for everybody. So it requires good conduct, it requires self-control. These are the conditions. And what will these do? These will clarify the mind in such a way that the truth becomes revealed by itself. All of these actions are purifying actions. You won't get it specifically through meditation or prayer or karma yoga or bhakti yoga, non-demanding love of God, not directly. These are ways of purifying the mind, clarifying the mind, so that the self will reveal itself by itself. It will be self-evident. And so, avoid things that are not sanctioned by or that are prohibited by all scriptures, be it the Vedas or the Smritis. Make sure that all the senses are under control. And one who has not turned away from the lure of the senses, nor one whose mind is not concentrated, one whose mind is scattered, nor one whose mind may be concentrated. But still, these are the conditions. That Ashanta Manasa, whose mind is not at rest, because of hankering for the result of concentration even. Yes, I meditate. Very good. But I'm not getting anywhere. Well, what do you expect? Oh, I expect a halo or enlightenment. I expect my face to beam forth. I expect a whole transformation of my life. This is no longer meditation. There's no such thing as competitive meditation. This mitigates against concentration. We're not hankering for any result of any kind. It only creates anxiety. Furthermore, we're not expecting any result in meditation. There are people who say, I want some experience in meditation. No. Meditation is centering oneself in this present moment where you catch that self that does not move, that does not change. And that can only be cultivated by cultivating something we're not quite used to. Stillness and silence. These two things are rare to obtain and have to be understood and had to be gotten. I was in conversation with somebody last night. They said, "Oh, I meditate. I walk in the garden. It's fine for me. Do you really require sitting?" I said, "Yes, you do." Of course, two types of meditation are there. Walking, in your working, waking, walking life, is meditation with the eyes open, with a sense of appreciation for what is described as this divine self within everything, what we call God, that entity that brings everything into harmony and is a flowing thing in your favor called grace, flowing through everything. Yes, we should do that. But meditation in the classical way of sitting with the eyes closed and taking an innermost journey, a mystic journey to within, where we discover the self as it is. Yes, it requires two factors: silence and stillness. And silence is internal silence as much as external silence. It is doing away, not being subject to all the traffic noises that go on in the head. As soon as we close our eyes, all of the traffic comes in and creates a traffic jam. Or we see the wandering mind go off here, go off there, and not being disciplined enough to call the attention back. This will not be silence. So, through knowledge, prajnana of Brahman, but the man who has desisted from bad conduct as also from the lure of the senses, whose mind has become concentrated, and who is also free from anxiety about the results of concentration, and has a teacher, a competent teacher is necessary, some entity that gives a catalyst, a momentum to your movement, some entity that's only acting from pure love, some entity that is the embodiment of love, that will love you like no other, that whose whole being is full of the knowledge, full of light. That entity shining and beaming forth has a transformative effect on everyone. So it's not just a teacher that is giving you the facts, not just an information transfer person, because now that would be the study. You won't get it by study. You won't get it by intellect and reasoning. You'll get it by inspiration. Whose mind has become concentrated and is also free from anxiety about the results of concentration, has a teacher, attains the foresaid self through knowledge. That is real knowledge. Real knowledge is self-evident. Anything short of it is lack of knowledge or ignorance. So next question is, how can we know thus as to where it is the self is, for which both the Brahmana, the priest, and the Kshatriya, the person who's protecting the priests, become food, and for which death takes the place of a curry. So that's the wonderful text that's going on. It goes like this. Yasya brahma cha kshatram cha ube bhavata udanaha mrityo yasyo pase chanakam ita veda yatra saha. The self to whom all the more sophisticated classes of people who should know better and who should behave better, but they are both as plain as cooked rice, and death is nothing more than water. They are also subject to it. So how can one know that self? Iti Katha Upanishadi Pratamada Jaya Divitya Vali. This section is completed. This is that section of the first chapter of the Katha Upanishad, and that's where it gets left off. How can one who is not of this kind, that is neither a Brahmana nor a Kshatriya, know the self, for which both this Brahman and Kshatriya, these higher echelons of society, and though they are upholders of all righteousness and the protectors of everything, bhavata, they become food. Even they become food, for which the self operates with the mechanism of mrityuha, death. Though it is the destroyer of all, upasakanam becomes a supplement to the food like a curry. Death accompanies us like the sauce or the curry or the flavor of food taken, for example, with rice. Can't avoid it. So being a person with a worldly intellect and devoid of the disciplines described, that we've just described in this way, like the man endowed with all those disciplines that we mentioned, so it doesn't tell us where, as it were, the self exists, and really in any great detail how to access it, only in a general way. So that leads us now to the second part and the third canto, as it were, the third Vali, as it's called. And there we find some very interesting concepts to go on forward with. And so I'm going to leave this off early. We'll just maybe make a brief entrance into it, as it were. So it begins with Ritam Pyantao, the knower of this Brahman, or this, I should say, this Brahman, which is the same as the self Atman, the worshippers of the five fires and those who perform the Nachiketa sacrifice 3 times, compared to shade and light, the two enjoyers of the inevitable results of work, who have entered within the body into the cavity of the heart, is the supreme abode of the Most High Brahman. So in other words, there are 2 drinkers of truth here. These drink the nectar of their good works, and they go off to heaven. This is giving a recap, because this is Nachiketa's second request that is being revisited. And in contrast to that, the final question bypasses this whole idea. Is it valuable to get a good post-mortem condition? Yes, there's some value in it, but it's not the end of the road. It's like purchasing a return ticket. And the ultimate and highest and most profound philosophy of the Vedanta will encourage you. Since this entity is right here, right now, why not buy a one-way ticket? That's our challenge. That's our subject of all these particular Upanishads. So let us just take a small further excursion into this subject. See, enjoying the results of your good deeds, that's one way. We said that had some merit in it. And so it is when the supreme entity, the Paramatman, the supreme self in you, gets coupled with the Jivatman, that is the Atman that is associated with your individuality. And that continues, that sense of individuality continues because your journey continues. So I'll give you the example that you know quite well. Supposing we want to take a journey to the airport, we take a taxi, and the taxi breaks down. This probably doesn't happen in Ireland or Europe, but certainly in Africa it may happen. And so do you abandon your journey, or you call another taxi, you transfer all your baggage, that is all your history, or your psychological history, your unconscious history that is caught in some skaras, subtle impressions, something like your baggage, all your possessions. You take all of them, you put them in another taxi, and you go on. It shouldn't prevent you from moving toward your ultimate goal, which is the discovery of this internal self. Commensurate with, same thing as discovery of Brahman, because when you find it individually, as it were, you'll find that there are no boundaries to it. It is the same as this universal principle, Brahman itself. So with these thoughts, we leave this off now for this year. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thank you.